Actually, not this time. This video in particular, I'm going to be using a good amount of music from other people, but don't worry, they'll be credited when the music pops up. You'll see why in a moment. Creepypasta. A term which once sent chills down the spines of many an NG teenager from the 2010s, and today is met with a mixed reaction of nostalgia, cringe, and confusion at what the hell a creepypasta is supposed to be. Of course, most of you already know, but creepypastas are essentially the internet equivalent of a campfire horror story, and the name comes from a portmanteau of the word copypasta, as in copy-pasted text, and of course, creepy. In the early days, these stories only existed as copy-pasted text posted on old forums until they formed their own communities and made a place for themselves on the internet. Now, though creepypastas have left a strangely unspoken mark on the internet's culture, it seems that while some still remember them fondly, many have looked back on them like an embarrassing phase, almost like it was a shared experience for everyone, that this was just that awkward teenage phase of them that they don't want to be reminded of. Now, I was a little bit on the young side to be into them, but also just old enough that I wouldn't miss them. So maybe that's why they're something I generally remember fondly, because that means I was generally, to be frank, more easily scared by them. Especially because I did not engage with any horror stuff before creepypastas. As a younger kid, I basically had no experience with horror, and I was more easily scared by a lot of these stories that others can look back at now and laugh at. I never really got into more horror until FNAF rolled around, and even still, I'd say I'm mostly even just quote-unquote into horror because it's kind of unavoidable on YouTube. It seems like there's always some other mascot horror game or analog horror or some game that everyone on the internet is playing that's some kind of horror. It's less a thing that I seek it out and more a thing that it's everywhere and I don't go out of my way to avoid it. Now, many are happy to see creepypastas fade away, but honestly, it fills me with a bit of a sense of sadness to see them go. Mostly because I worry it's not just their relevance that's disappearing, but their history to some extent. If you yourself used to be a fan of creepypastas, let me ask you this. Could you name your top 5 right now? Much like a joke in a weird way, looking back on a creepypasta, the details about them are actually weirdly difficult to remember. And while I know that there are plenty that I enjoyed and remember fondly, when I ask myself which ones were the best from my memory, I could hardly remember any except the most obvious and popular ones that everyone knows. Ben Drowned came to mind, of course, Mario, and No End House was one that I remembered quite fondly, but on the spot, that was all I could muster. 3 stories, and that was it. I could think of other popular ones, sure, but the rest of them were all popular but not good. We're talking Jeff the Killer, Sonic.exe, the Tails doll. These stories actually were cringe. They actually were bad. They actually didn't need to be remembered. Those ones, yeah, maybe those are better off buried. Still, it nagged me. This is part of my history on the internet, damn it. I cared for it so much, and yet it was disappearing both from the internet and from my mind. I knew I was missing so much more, but all I had was memories of moments or fleeting feelings where these stories briefly invoked something in me. I just couldn't extract many exact names or wider narratives from my memory, and it was really bothering me. Having picked up some more of the pieces since then while still looking at an incomplete picture, I think this may have been because it was sort of true that your average creepypasta wasn't of the highest quality, but that almost every one had at least that one moment that absolutely shone and rose above the rest of the story. That made some things hard to remember though, because you don't remember the whole story anymore, you just remember the good bit. And maybe after a while, with nothing else in your head to connect that good bit to, you even forget the good bit exists, and then it's gone forever from your mind. I've been looking back and trying to pick up these pieces, because I very strongly felt that there was something there with creepypastas. Something we've forgotten and turned our backs on today, but my memory is just so scattered about them that it's been hard to piece together. I've been trying to rediscover what it even was that I used to enjoy listening to, digging up 8-year-old remains of the content I used to enjoy, and as I did this, I was reminded of a story I never got around to listening to. I remember being told by so many people that The Showers was one of the greatest creepypastas ever written. So good, in fact, that the author went on to write an actual book building upon the story. Back then, though, I was much more into the very internet-centric creepypastas around gaming and stuff like that, and this was much more your typical bland horror story. That, combined with it being a 2.5-hour long listen to hear in full, led me to putting it on the back burner, and only honouring my commitment to come back and give it a listen at some point, now, years later. So, with all that said, crank up the volume, turn down the lights. No, hang on a minute. The vibe, it isn't right here. The vibes aren't right. We can't be doing a homage to creepypastas if the vibes aren't right.
Okay, first things first, gotta get rid of this fucking Balloons Tower Defense gameplay. But I don't know, what do I play that's spooky? Fuck it, COD Zombies. Add a nice little vignette, do a little bit of this and that. There we go, that looks a little bit better. And of course, the most important detail. Honestly, I should be ashamed of myself. I can't believe I was actually about to start making a video like this, only playing my own music. It's time to put some goddamn respect on Kevin MacLeod and Muse names. We're going back to the fucking classics. There we fucking go, that's what I like to hear. Oh, and side note, while a lot of these tracks only took me a few minutes to find by looking up old Creepypasta music, this track in particular was the one I most desperately wanted to put in this video, and it might have taken me around 90 minutes to find it. Listen, the beginning of the track doesn't sound that much like the rest of it, so I skipped over it. Okay, whatever. Vibes successfully established. Let's go.
So, first of all, you know what I'm going to say. Please go and read or listen to a reading of The Showers before continuing with this video. If you really don't want to, I will be giving a basic description of the events of the story for those who'd be lost otherwise or need a recap, but I really do recommend checking it out first. A quick summary of the events of the story would not only be spoilers, but I would think genuinely ruin the enjoyment of the whole story for someone who's never read it. The author is very skillful at delivering each piece of the plot slowly and entertainingly, and really keeping you on the edge of your seat throughout. However, if you strip away all their writing style, the story can seem very uneventful from a very disconnected perspective. So with all that said, I sure hope anyone watching beyond this point has either already read the story or at the very least will never read it anyway. The Showers is a story which follows our main character Jack, who admits right from the start of the story that he's always loved making up horror stories to tell his friends, and that he's always been the one crying wolf for fun. But of course, the story he attempts to tell us this time, he can only assure us, is real. The story is, in a way, sort of split into 3 parts. The first part is about someone else's recounting of the horrors of the Showers. The second part is about Jack going to find the Showers himself once realizing they were in fact real. And the final part is about Jack being pressured into coming back to visit the Showers again years later. In the first part, Jack tells us of how he used to travel all over America, moving schools and houses very frequently, and how, as a result, he'd act as a bit of a class clown because it was a quick way for him to make friends in his constantly changing environment. He'd make a lot of enemies with the teachers this way, but he was always gone and on to the next school before the consequences would reach him. All that said, there was one teacher he got along with, Mr. Mays, a social studies teacher who was basically just the spitting image of the cool teacher. However, one Halloween, Mr. Mays cancels his entire lesson to instead tell the horror story of the Showers. For the first half of the story, being a connoisseur of campfire horror himself, Jack is enthralled and taking notes for his own storytelling. It's clear that Mr. Mays is enjoying himself too for the most part. But slowly as the story progresses, Mr. Mays' tone shifts, and it starts to become clear that he's having genuine emotional difficulty recounting the events of the story. He talks about his friends going out on a road trip when they were younger, driving wherever with not much of a specific goal in mind, ending up in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. One of their friends mentions their grandfather lives nearby, so they could pay him a surprise visit. But of course, they get lost. Eventually, they find an old abandoned barn house, and they decide to look around in case they can maybe find out where they are from it. They find an old cellar door, and as the place seems to be long abandoned, they decide to nervously venture in and see what they can find. They find an old, strange tunnel with walls lined with metal sheets, and a ceiling that constantly unevenly drops and rises, sometimes allowing you to stand comfortably but sometimes needing to be crouched under, all lit by old light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. They start to hear what sounds like the moaning of an animal in the distance in front of them, as if it's dying. Eventually they come across a bright red door with a knocker, which looks ominously nice compared to everything else in the decrepit surroundings. One of Mr. May's friends, Steve, goes to knock on the door, to no response, and they reluctantly go to open it. The lights suddenly burn out and pop, and part of the ceiling collapses in on the friend's head. In the panic, they all stumble inwards through the door frame. There's still some small level of light coming from the old light bulbs still burning out, but visibility is low. Trying to get to his feet, Mr. Mays goes to grab something which seems to be a shower head sticking out of the wall. In the panic, many of them didn't notice it at first, but they're wet with something. Some sort of liquid that smells absolutely putrid, but with the low light level, the colour and consistency of it is a mystery. And as the lights slowly come back on, they see that they are surrounded by silhouettes of children, all wearing tattered nightgowns soaked in whatever putrid substances were down there, each one having hair so long that it had clearly never been cut. The children all stare at them with a look which is described as absolute burning hatred. Mr. Mays picks up his friend's body and they all make a run for the exit. Mr. Mays ends the story with a more typical moral about being careful where they go trick-or-treating, and that's that for a while. Jack is blown away by the story and starts to retell it himself, always embellishing little bits here and there with whatever he thinks the person he's talking to will be most scared by. Always changing the ending to whatever he thinks will be the most spine-tingling for whoever's hearing it, until eventually, years later, he meets Mr. Mays again in a bar in New York. Only this time as adults. Mr. Mays is clearly drinking himself to death, and when Jack brings up the story, he learns that Mr. Mays meant every word of it. He even reveals that his friend Steve from the story didn't make it out alive, and that his death haunts him to this day. The police didn't believe them, and more than anything, he was haunted by the fact that they could never find the body. The second part of the story is all about Jack going on a long search for the place himself and eventually managing to find it, only to accidentally fall inside it and barely make it out alive. Now that might sound like I've just skipped over a lot, but the thing is, a lot of the events when returning to the showers are sort of retreads. When Jack experiences them firsthand, he sees much of the same thing that Mr. Mays described: the shower heads, the creepy children, the putrid dripping nondescript liquid. A lot of the unique stuff is more just what Jack isn't sure about in the darkness. He keeps swearing he can feel things or see things, but never feeling sure. He falls down there with no light to work with and takes a huge hit to the head on the way down too, leaving him not entirely sure what's real or not. The third and final part is all about Jack sort of falling into a relationship with a girlfriend that's described as being as uniquely fucked up as he is, only for her to, of course, eventually push him on his story about the showers and insist they go find them again. Jack is very reluctant, of course, but gets pressured into going along. And once they find it, the farmhouse is no longer there, and so at first they don't think they're at the right place. Jack desperately tries to convince his girlfriend, Karen. Yes, Karen. It's a complete coincidence too, because this story is way too old for the whole Karen meme to have factored into that name, but it's very unfortunately fitting. He tries to convince Karen they should just go home, only to kick off an argument with her over whether he's being a coward or he really has just been lying about the story the whole time, especially because he kept changing the ending and things like that. Eventually though, as they argue, Karen suddenly realizes she's standing on the cellar door. It was covered in mud and dirt, but it was still there. They are at the right place. And she goes in without Jack, forcing him to follow after her despite all his fears. They both have another confrontation with the horrific children and see that they also have stag horns. For a moment it seems like this time they may truly be screwed because their exit caves in, but they are saved at the last moment by their friend Brian being able to see them through a crack in the ceiling and hoisting them out with a rope. Karen and Jack are both physically sick for a while after the ordeal and decide to apologize to each other and break up. Jack decides that the showers is no longer his story. He's going to stop retelling the story over and over and start talking to a therapist about his problems. And that's it. No, really, that's the end. Hell, that story might have even sounded like it kind of sucked if you haven't seen the quality of the writing in the original story. I think what gets most people, though, is just how unsatisfying this ending is. I mean, what is the showers? What's up with the creepy antler children? Why all the shower heads? How much of it was real? What was the mysterious liquid dropping from the heads? Why was that one door so well kept while the rest of the place was so run down? What was the significance of that door? Were the children even aggressive? They act plenty menacing, but they never actually do anything but stand there and act creepy the whole time. They never attack or bite or anything like that. They just creep people out. At a lot of points in the story, the narration switched to speaking about the showers as if they were a sentient being, which seems to be a very intentional choice, so is there a reason for that? It's implied that while most of the local people in the area don't know about the showers, there is a small family running a nearby gas station who knows about it and always gave a certain stern response when asked about it. It was something like, "We don't deal with things like that anymore around here." Do they have a hand in what's going on down there? These are all questions that you'd expect at least some answers to by the end of the story, and you kinda don't get any. Now, credit where it's due, you can sort of begin to construct an answer to some of these questions, with some creative interpretation reading between the lines. But even then, you'll only be able to get a couple answers that way, and the vast majority of the story will forever remain a mystery. That isn't an oversight, however. It's pretty clear this unsatisfying gap is by design, and that is what I can't quite come to terms with. Now, if you want my honest opinion on the showers as a story, here's my take. It is an excellently written story, and the author clearly has a talent for his craft. I know that there are some people who only swear by the original telling of the story. I think the later parts revisiting the showers started going down in quality, especially the large crowd that could not stand Karen. But I never felt that way, and I do think the story feels incomplete without the final parts. All that being said, I have to be honest. Both the reputation that preceded the story and the long build-ups throughout promised more of a payoff at the end, and I can't lie, despite making an attempt to understand why it's written the way it is, with the assumption that maybe I'm missing something, maybe there's something to interpret here that's going over my head, I do think that the story disappoints a little when it comes to sticking the landing at the end. I didn't expect an answer to every one of my questions, but I would have liked an answer to, well, I don't know, at least a couple of them, or an answer to a question I would not have even thought to ask, which may give me new perspective on the story, would also have been nice. The current ending as is just doesn't really sit right with me. With all that said, I can't really explain my issues with the story more deeply without explaining the best interpretation of the ending I could possibly muster to answer as many of my questions as possible while making as few leaps in logic as I could manage. The whole story I was trying to pay as close attention as possible, to try and pull some subtext and see if there was any reading between the lines to be done, and so quite early on I started forming a bit of a hypothesis in my head. With how much of the horror and threat of the showers is focused onto the characters feeling sick, or the ways they let their own mind mess with them, very early on I got the vibe that there's something we're supposed to take away from this. The showers is a very real and very horrific place. However, the supernatural seeming evils that inhabit it exist only in the minds of its victims. The children themselves also may be real, however they may simply just be that, abused, neglected children, left to wither away in the showers for reasons we'll never know. The children are constantly implied to be supernatural, but they don't do much throughout the course of the story to actually suggest so. They mostly just stare and breathe creepily. Ooh. A good line to get across what I mean is what Jack says about them when locking eyes with them later in the third part of the story, which to paraphrase was something along the lines of, "The moment I looked into their eyes, I knew in my heart, with more certainty than I've ever felt for anything before, that they hated me every single bit as much as I feared them." And that deep level of unexplained hatred is creepy and definitely doesn't feel natural. But ultimately, Jack's judgment that hatred is what he's seeing in those children's eyes is something completely in his head. And so it's perfectly possible for his mental state to be getting the better of him. The story doesn't get specific about what makes Jack quote-unquote uniquely fucked up, as he puts it, but at the very least, he definitely explicitly experiences panic attacks and physical sickness and vomiting from fear, so he has anxiety at the very minimum. The only other people who have ever set foot into the showers and lived to tell the tale are Karen, who also has similar mental illnesses, and Mr. Mays. The only question mark there is Mr. Mays, but we do know at the very least he went on to drink himself to death, unable to cope with the trauma that the showers inflicted upon him. So it's pretty safe to say that he probably wasn't 100% stable in the head either. It's also sort of implied that while he came alive in the classroom, his family life wasn't as smooth sailing. He even let slip when talking to Jack as an adult that when he was retelling the story to the children, it was because his therapist told him to talk about it, with the implication being that no one else he knew would have listened, and then in hindsight he deeply regretted pushing it onto the children. Either way, the theory I began to speculate on was that the showers was a representation of the consequences of alcoholism, as every person in the story who recounts the horrors of the showers is an alcoholic. At the time I first started building this up in my head, I wasn't very certain, as I wasn't even at the halfway point of the story yet, but just as I was sort of testing the validity of that theory to myself in my head, I came upon a moment in the story which really solidified it, and also ended up becoming one of my favourite parts of the story. Shortly before Jack arrives at the showers for the first time, he falls asleep in the car and has a dream. In this dream, he's back in the bar in New York City where he met Mr. Mays. Just like before, Mr. Mays is sitting with his head in his arms, sunk into the bar top. Both of them have a glass with a shot of whiskey in front of them. Now, if I remember correctly, Jack goes to have a drink, but starts to feel concerned when he realizes Mr. Mays isn't moving. However, he's quickly distracted by a dripping sound. He looks around and realizes the glass he finished is already refilled. He hesitates for a moment, confused, but takes another drink. He realizes that the Mr. Mays lying next to him is dead at the bar, and is put further on edge by the continuing dripping sound, dripping just like the heads in the showers. He looks in front of him yet again to find his glass filled with whiskey, and this time he stares at it. He sees a drop of whiskey fall slowly into it from above, and hears that dreaded drip. He looks up and he sees it. At the top of the bar, hovering just over his glass, is a rusty shower head, just like the ones from the showers. Drip, drip, drip. Slowly dripping more whiskey into his glass, slowly encouraging him to keep drinking until it kills him. Now, the alcohol theory was pretty close, but a bit too specific. In hindsight, with the full context of the story now, I think it's a representation of the evils of self-destructive behavior generally. Jack is not only a mentally unwell, chain-smoking, drug-taking alcoholic, but the story also makes a point of going over his relationship with Karen. Now again, if you want the details, read the story, but in short, it's presented as destructive for both of them, but hard to break out of. They both thoroughly enjoy each other's company and are glad to have someone to talk to like themselves, but they also use each other to avoid confronting or processing each other's issues, and are too emotionally unstable to hold each other up. Jack sees all of this from step one, but finds Karen too hard to turn down. They never even plan to get together, but before they know it, they're living together. Considering the big conclusion of the story was mostly just Jack breaking up with Karen and moving on with his life, clearly the author felt like this was an important note to end on. So I feel like the significance of this is that by finally breaking away from her and beginning to talk to a therapist, Jack is finally choosing to live. He's choosing not to let Karen take them on a downward spiral that will break both of them. He's choosing not to drink himself to death until his liver fails on him like it did for Mr. Mays. He's choosing not to let the showers kill him. Even the whole idea of him wanting to give up the story so the story of the showers will no longer be his and will no longer terrorize him, I think is supposed to be a metaphor for giving up coping mechanisms and confronting your issues head on. It's mentioned that every single time Jack retold the story, he'd change the monsters and the ending a bit to suit whoever was hearing it. While the story was real, he always chose to embellish it with lies to make it scarier, or give it a more satisfying ending. He always had to add in fake details to cope with, rationalize, and even glamorize his experience. He could not confront what happened to him for what it was, and the only way he could was to stop retelling the story, and stop rewriting it to make it make sense. He had to accept what really happened without embellishing his little flares here and there, and he had to stop forcing himself to relive the horrors of what happened to him every single day. For this reason, it became my sort of headcanon theory that the nondescript putrid liquid leaking from the showers was a mulched together mix of drugs, tobacco, alcohol, bodily fluids, everything that people use to slowly destroy themselves while living in denial. And the children are the consequences of that. Children to parents who chose to destroy their lives with these substances, who with no one fit to care for them left, were simply locked away, underground, to slowly succumb to the same neglect their parents showed themselves. This all seemed to fit together very nicely, especially with the one last line near the end, which I took as a near confirmation of my interpretation of the story. When Jack escapes the showers for the final time, he goes to take a sip of whiskey from his flask to recover, only to be stopped by a burning sensation in his nose he gets as he opens the flask. A sensation described just like the way the horrific stench of the showers burned his eyes, nose, and throat. It's as if he finally realized that the whiskey he held in his hands and the showers both stood for that same suicidal horror. Now, that all sounds nice and all, but, well, while I still think this is a nice interpretation and one of the strongest ones we have so far, there are still things about the story that don't sit right with me even with this interpretation. First of all, I think the final part debunked my little theory about the liquid coming from the showers because apparently it has a metallic taste to it, which can only really mean two things as far as I can think. Either it is just normal water, just filthy with the rust and filth the heads are covered in, or it's blood, since blood has a metallic taste from the iron in it, but blood would be spooky, but doesn't really make much logical sense. So I think we're supposed to take that it's just normal water? I mean, I guess that makes sense with the whole most of it is in your head angle, but come on man, that's weak. Second, I am kind of bothered by the fact that we never get, like, anything at all to go off of on whether there's a point or purpose to the shower heads. I know this might sound strangely specific, but the idea of ominously seeing shower heads in places that make no sense, that have some malicious unknown purpose, is one I actually find really compelling. And it's a direction I hope the story would go in, but nope. It seems like they really did just want their spooky place to be a shower block for no reason in particular. It's a little deflating, honestly. Speaking of which, when they finally do get a bit of a clearer look at the place towards the end, apparently all it's covered in is just mud and frost. I mean, come on, I'm not asking for the whole place to be covered in blood and entrails, but it would have been nice to see something unexpected down there after spending the whole story with this mystery about what the place is covered in to make it smell so bad. As well as that, I thought I was finally piecing something together midway through the story when Jack fell into the showers for himself for the first time. He fell in on the other side of the door that Mr. Mays got to before running out, and in Mr. Mays' story, there was a sound like a dying animal coming from that direction. But when Jack falls down there, he only hears the breathing of the children. Later though, Jack goes to scream for help, but with his injuries combined with the stench being so horrific it feels like it's burning his vocal cords, it leads to nothing but a sound coming out that the story very specifically chooses to describe as being like a dying animal. Now, considering Jack was in the same room that the dying animal sound from Mr. Maze's story would be coming from, and now he was the one making the sound described exactly the same way, I thought the implication here would be that the dying sound was coming from the children trying to speak, or perhaps it was feeding into some sort of vicious cycle twist where the victim it last trapped remains there forever as the next one to make that sound crying for help. I thought it would go somewhere, but it never really does, so I guess I'm just led to believe that extremely specific choice of word and location was just a complete unintentional coincidence? It's just especially weird since later there's a stag hanging out down there and it turns out it's making the sound and like, what? Why is there just a stag here? I don't think there's anything strange about it as well, it's just kind of there. Speaking of which, the choice to make the children have antlers in the third part of the story is a little confusing. So like, are they supernatural or what? You can see my frustrations here. So overall, I do think there's some real writing talent behind the showers, and I do think it's a story worth listening to. That being said, I think it's fair to say the ending disappoints. I kept thinking it must have just gone over my head, that there's something I'm not seeing here, but if there is, then it looks like it's me and everyone else, because I tried to seek out other interpretations of the story as a sanity check, and it seems that most others either took it at face value or speculated on conclusions that do fit with the story but don't really have much evidence at all, like the children being victims of a devil-worshipping cult or something. So, what was the point of all that? Well, honestly, in a weird way, well, I know it likely isn't. The whole story felt like a microcosm, acting as a meta-commentary on creepypastas. I have to imagine it's unintentional, but it feels at times like the story is almost a critique of the limitations of writing horror, rather than drawing, animating, or composing it. Like Jack says in the story, he knows what we truly fear, and it's the unknown. The showers, in some ways, could never have had a satisfying ending. That's why Jack always had to make up a better one. That's why he changed his story every time, because he could never accept the ending he got. Just like I can't now. Just like I'm trying to twist and reinterpret the words in the story into an ending we might like more, only to be met with more confusion. If the showers ended with the reveal that the children never really existed, meaning they were either all ghosts or all in their head, we would have rolled our eyes. If the showers ended by telling us the liquids that the place was always soaked in was in fact blood, we all would have groaned. If the showers ended with the reveal that there truly was definitively nothing supernatural about that place, and it was just a place where horrific child abuse was covered up, maybe that wouldn't be quite as bad, but it wouldn't be scary. If there were a big twist, perhaps we'd be more entertained. But how could you even construct a fitting and appropriately built up twist out of the story we have here? Maybe you could have revealed that Steve, Mr. Maze's friend who never made it, ended up becoming one of the children if you wanted a twist, but that kind of raises more questions than answers. No, the showers could only have ever ended one way, as a mystery, as an unknown to fear. This is why I'm still almost convinced there's something more going over my head. The story seems almost self-aware that its ending is unsatisfying, but ultimately still the best I can come up with is this. The showers knows it's a piece of writing trying to scare you, and the showers knows you fear the unknown. The showers knows it can't show you a scary image or play a scary sound. The showers knows it can only construct and present ideas. Ideas you can only receive if you know them, when you only fear the unknown. And so the showers has to leave you hanging, give you constant somethings without elaboration, play on ill-defined implications, force you to piece together what's happening by building your understanding of the events of the story from the shaky foundations of what is gestured at but never defined. It can't simply sit down and tell you what happened. To do that would be to leisurely guide you through a fully lit room when the intention is to plunge you into a foreboding mass of darkness. And while the story does an excellent job of this throughout, the sad truth remains unchanging. That because the showers must tell itself this way, the showers could never have had a satisfying ending. The showers could never finish by turning on the lights and letting us see the meaning of everything that just happened. Because all it could show us would either be the nothing that would cease our fear, or the blood and death that would make it indistinguishable from any other poorly written, predictable gore fest. This is it. This is the limitation of creepypasta. For as much as I hate to admit it, I think the reason I remember so many moments so fondly, so vividly, but struggle to piece together entire stories I used to love, is that most can't stick the landing at the end, and not even necessarily through fault of their own. What do you do when the time comes to end a story and start explaining yourself? When that very thing will be the fastest way to deflate the lingering dread your story hopes to establish by the end. It really seems like the best you can do is either pull a twist ending or bite the bullet and take your unsatisfying but mysterious ending. Even if you go for a twist though, not only is a good twist ending hard to construct, but what if your story was simply never meant to have a twist? Not every story needs a twist ending. In fact, I have an inkling that the perceived need for a twist ending is a big reason why so many even more popular pastas have cringe-inducing garbage endings sometimes, because stories that clearly never needed a twist ending get one forced upon them. To point at Dead Bart, for example, one of the most well-known lost episode creepypastas of all time, I'll actually go out to bat and defend it a little here. I think aside from towards the beginning, Matt Groening literally bursting into tears upon the mere mention of the episode is kinda dumb and heavy-handed, but the rest of the setup throughout the beginning and middle is pretty good, I feel. I remember the first time through, it very much gave me that vibe, like you know something awful is about to happen, and that things seem off, but also feeling powerless to do anything but brace for impact. It really succeeded in establishing a sense of dread in me, until it completely whacked me out of the immersion with the twist ending that when they go to visit Bart's grave, oh no! The other gravestones are every guest voice actor The Simpsons has ever had, with accurate birth and death dates, even for the voice actors that haven't died yet. Woo! It predicted all their deaths. That twist was so dumb, even horror illiterate 13-year-old me was just smacked by tonal whiplash from paralyzing fear to loud laughter. That's not to say a creepypasta can't have a good ending, but I struggle to think of a single one that does, where the ending isn't some kind of twist. Candle Cove, the kids were hallucinating the show. The Russian sleep experiment, the test subjects were being possessed by something that sleep protects them from. No End House, there is no escape, and the house truly is endless. Stairs, the old lady can walk. Mr. Widemouth, he had done it before, and while he didn't kill the author, he's killed plenty before him. Ben Drowned, we'll never know if the author is the one who's free from Ben's hauntings, or if Ben successfully possessed the author and they're the one who was freed from the cartridge. While there's certainly plenty of examples of good creepypastas that don't have twist endings, the few that come to mind are more good for the rest of their stories, not so much the endings. While it hurts to say having such a fondness for them and a quiet longing for the return of the days of creepypasta reading channels, shout outs to Mutahar of Some Ordinary Gamers, I'm one of the OGs. I was there back in the creepypasta reading days. I was subbed back when he had like 10k subscribers and now he's like 10 million. That's my boy. Anyway, as I was saying, as much as I may quietly long for those days back, I think I could accept it's for the best that we move on from creepypastas. Maybe I do need to stop retelling the story of creepypastas over and over and over, changing little details here and there, embellishing the story with my own flares, over and over trying to retell it in a way to sell the feelings it left me with to the generations that were either too young or too old to understand. While there's plenty there, the harsh truth is that the ending is unsatisfying, and maybe rather than constantly try to reinterpret that ending as to one I think will land better, I need to accept it for what it is so I can stop trying to retell it and move on. With all that said though, while I can accept moving on from creepypastas, as things like analog horror come to take its place, I still don't want it to be forgotten. Hit or miss, cringe or chilling, these stories are a significant part of the history of internet culture. And it's still true that nothing out there has ever been quite the same as creepypastas. While holistically they generally could never have held up to scrutiny, they managed to create moments along the way of unforgettable fear. When the time was right, when just enough of the scene was set, and yet so much was still shrouded in darkness, for as much as creepypastas have become a thing of the past, I believe in learning from them, not burying them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.